We all need to invest. Nobody knows what the future holds, but a typical lifetime comes with some major expenses. There's housing, of course, weddings, funerals, operations, holidays, children's education, and cars. But most important of all, there's retirement. Unfortunately, very few South Africans manage to save sufficiently during their working lives. And added to this, the average lifespan among healthy, financially literate university graduates has risen to 88 years. And the number of people living to 100 continues to grow. People leaving work today typically spend 20 years or more in retirement. That's a very long time to last without a regular salary. So how should we invest? How do we give ourselves the very best chance of achieving our financial goals? At the very least, how do we ensure that we don't run out of money before we die, leaving us to rely on our loved ones or the state for financial support? Historically, the biggest investment returns have come from owning shares in companies or equities. A team from London Business School has carried out a detailed study into the performance of different asset classes around the world since 1900. It found that over the long term, shares are the runaway winner. Their findings are summarized in a book called Triumph of the Optimists.
If you plot through the history, using the work that I've done with my London Business School colleagues, Paul Marsh and Mike Staunton, where we've looked at the performance of individual stock markets. We've now got data for 23 different markets running from 1900 with data up to 2015. Some of those markets prospered on the way in a direction that was largely going upwards and onwards, although there were some setbacks. We called it Triumph of the Optimists because our view was that back in 1900, only real optimists would have poured their money into industrial and commercial common stocks, and that many risk-averse investors would have played safe with government securities. It was the optimists, the people who were not frightened, who performed very well.
So let's look at the figures for South Africa. According to Professor Dimson and his team, between 1900 and 2016, cash has delivered an annualized real return, in other words, adjusted for the effects of inflation, of 1%. Bonds have returned 1.7%, but shares have produced an average annual return of 7.1%. In fact, South Africa has been one of the better performing markets globally over the period. The annualized real return on South African equities between 1967 and 2016 was even better, at 7.5%. You could, if you wanted to, invest your money yourself by investing in individual stocks, but the transactional fees and costs would be considerable. It would also be very time-consuming monitoring the individual performance of your stocks in the portfolio. Most investors give their money to professional stock pickers who actively manage their money for them. Mark Hebner is a financial advisor and investment author based in California.
So active investing has to do with an investment strategy where an individual or a fund manager is trying to beat a market. I say a market because there are many different markets in this world, international, US, even bond markets. And so they try to engage in different strategies such as picking stocks, trying to time the market, trying to select managers who will do one of those things and beat the market. And lastly, trying to choose an investment style that they think will have the best return at some near-term future. In essence, it's speculation versus investing, and it's actually a very bad idea because we have mountains of evidence that says that none of those things actually work.
There have been several detailed studies of active fund performance in developed markets. David Blake, of the Pensions Institute in the UK, explains how only a tiny proportion of active managers outperform long-term after costs.
The evidence shows, both for the UK and the US, if we're talking about mutual funds in particular, that a very small proportion, around about 1%, outperform in the long term on a risk and cost-adjusted basis. So 99% of fund managers deliver negative value added for their consumers once you take into account the fees that they charge.
Another problem active investors face is that a large number of funds are what are called closet trackers. In other words, although they claim to be actively managed, they broadly track the whole market. After costs, they're almost guaranteed to underperform.
To beat the market, an active manager needs to show conviction, but they're just as likely to be wrong as they are to be right. And just because they've been right in the past doesn't mean they'll continue to be right in the future. Distinguishing genuine skill from pure luck is extremely difficult.
If you put a large number of monkeys on a large number of typewriters for a large amount of time, one of them will type out to be or not to be. But you don't necessarily hire that monkey to write your next play. I mean, my work, which applies partly to the US, sometimes to the UK, and also to Germany, suggests about 70% of funds are just closet trackers. So you're paying them a fee for something that you could really do yourself. About 20% your grandma could do better than them, so they actually remove value from the investment process. And about 5% probably are skilled managers. But having said that, they are probably harder to find than the Higgs boson.
The findings of Professors Blake and Cuthbertson are backed by Spiva, the S&P Index versus Active Scorecard. Spiva confirms that most managers underperform most of the time, and that persistent outperformance is extremely rare. This is the case globally and in South Africa.
Spiva is a report that we put out globally to 8 countries or 8 regions. We've done this since 2002 for the US, and we started in South Africa around 2015. Spiva really looks at how does actively managed funds compare to their traditional benchmarks or indices over various periods. So in the South African context, we've actually seen that the results are no different to our international results. Where probably about 80 to 90% of fund managers or funds would typically underperform a benchmark in the equity space. We also have a persistency scorecard that measures how these funds perform year after year. And we can see that looking at top quartile fund managers, they actually decline, that only around 1 to 2% of these fund managers stay in the top quartile over a 5-year period.
This begs the question, why do active funds generally perform so poorly? Well, central to the challenge is that active management is a zero-sum game. For one manager to win, another must lose. And because the industry has grown in size, it's become increasingly difficult for a single manager to consistently outperform their peers.
And the problem for most people, I think, is they just don't recognize, not paying attention to, how very many people there are who use the same kind of computers, have access to the same kind of staff, have Mike Bloomberg's wonderful system for gathering data and information any way you want it, use the same securities analysis and same securities research, get the same information from all the companies because regulators require it, so that they're par equal, and a whole bunch of different really important factors that 50, 40, 30 years ago really differentiated the winners from the others. But now it's not a differentiation because everybody has it.
Another question you might be asking is why so many investors still choose to use actively managed funds in the face of all this evidence, that after fees and charges, only a few of them manage to beat the market.
One reason is that the active fund industry is extremely lucrative, and firms have huge budgets to spend on PR and advertising. Investors are often charmed into the belief that managers can beat the market. This would be based on past performance and likely over a much shorter period. But there's no guarantee that this can be repeated. There's a rising wave of discontent from advisors to retail investors as active managers appear to be inconsistent with their promise to outperform the market. Thankfully, for these investors, there are alternatives.